Okay, well, if we're going to talk about the images, the icons, then we definitely need to talk about Empress Irene. So she was maybe one of the most, and yes, in this generation, in this era, we have empresses. In Rome, we didn't really have any clear empresses, but here we actually see several women seize power and just rule themselves at various points. And Empress Irene is one of them. And like many empresses, she had to get into power through kind of backwards, complicated way. Originally, she was a regent, meaning someone who, was in charge on behalf of someone else. In her case, it was her son, Constantine VI. But she wanted to seize power for herself. So she eventually had to fight him for power and finally won in 797. And as one of the power moves of all time, had her own son blinded in the very room where she had given birth to him, which is a very special room by this point. If you were born in that room, you were supposed to be eligible in this purple room to be an emperor. So born in the purple, that was the sign of being an emperor. But she just straight up took the throne for herself and became empress. And she had a lot on her plate. She had a lot of threats, a lot of attempted assassinations, a lot of rebellions, but she managed to hold on to power for a good 20 years or so, which is pretty interesting. And one of the things about her is that she officially ended iconoclasm. She decreed that it was not allowed, that icons were officially cool and officially sacred, and people could use them and worship them. Now, interestingly, one of the things about her is that she was interested in trying to reunify with the Roman Church. They weren't completely schismed at this point. There was a lot of possibility for them to get back together. So that was one hope of hers. And she also had some interest in making allies with the Carolingian Empire, the so-called Holy Roman Empire. In fact, at one point, there was a marriage proposal considered between Irene and Charlemagne. So just imagine, I don't know, this is my sort of alternate history, historical power couple fantasy, that they would have been, ruling over such a large territory. They could have had an empire on the scale of the Romans, and in a different way brought back the Roman Empire. But it was not to be. The other people in Byzantium opposed the marriage, and so she ultimately didn't go that route. And eventually, she and Charlemagne ended up being enemies because by 800, Charlemagne and Leo had declared themselves the ones in charge. And so she could not have the legitimacy of Rome according to them. So they ultimately had to be rivals. But yeah, there was a large line of communication between the two empires. And we also have the Abbasid Caliphate operating primarily out of Baghdad as its political center. Like I said, Baghdad is where the knowledge and learning, new discoveries in astronomy, where all that kind of stuff is happening. During this time period is Harun al-Rashid, and he is quite famous in Islamic culture. He is sort of the founder of a golden age in a lot of ways. He's always thought of that way anyway. He was a leader of learning and, just this sort of guy who was sponsoring knowledge and discovery. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, that was like their equivalent of the Library of Alexandria. He basically got that whole thing started. He's so famous, in fact, that he has a lot of cameos in the 1001 Nights, which you might also hear called the Arabian Nights. This is a sort of collection of stories that are all sort of interrelated to each other. So it'll be a character telling a story, and then another character tells a story within that story, and just goes on until you've gone through a whole bunch of different stories. And the frame of it is this young woman who is going to be put to death by this king. But she bargains for one more night by telling him a story, and then he wants to hear the next part of the story. So he spares her for another night, and he just keeps sparing her for night after night for 1001 nights. And then eventually, by the end of all that time, he's fallen in love with her, and so they get married instead. So that's nice. And this is still a famous work, kind of coming out of this time period, written down a little bit later on, but sort of evolving out of this time period. So if you're interested in literature, that's one you'd want to keep in mind. And Harun al-Rashid, whose name means Aaron the Righteous, roughly. He is the righteous one. He is supposed to be a really good leader. He makes a lot of cameos, usually as the symbol of a good leader in the 1001 Nights. He's not the one who's putting people to death. He's more somebody who's making a lot of cameos. Um, and of course, he was right next to Empress Irene, Baghdad and Byzantium, or I should say Constantinople, pretty near each other. They had their own fights, but eventually they reached a peace agreement. Although he got a better deal than she did, which may be one reason why the Byzantine Empire sort of started to decline. But after Harun, the caliphate, the original Abbasid caliphate, started to decline kind of as well. He split it among his sons, and he split the empire up. And that's a recipe for bad news, because the sons are just going to fight each other for territory. And so that didn't really work out, and that led to some struggles for his empire after he was gone. But in his own time, he was thought of as a pretty capable leader. And here's one of my favorite stories. He was in contact with Charlemagne, and he sent Charlemagne an elephant. We even know the name of the elephant. The elephant was named Abul Abbas. And that, and I'll get more into that story in a second. But here's a little bit of the map of Baghdad during his time period. There's still some remnants of that, the round city at the center. It's supposedly a pretty beautiful city. Some of the mosques from that time period are still around. This is on the river Tigris, so sort of in the region that used to be known as Mesopotamia. Unfortunately, most of this was burned down when the Mongols invaded later on, I believe in the 1200s, but a pretty significant city. Okay, so let's get back to that elephant. So Charlemagne sent a bunch of ambassadors to Harun al-Rashid, and this painting totally doesn't depict what that actually looked like, but people like the idea of it, right? And so Charlemagne sent some messengers, and then Harun al-Rashid says, yeah, let's make friends with this guy, and sent him back an elephant. And apparently it was a white elephant. And the story is that Isaac the Jew, this is what this Latin here means, Isaac the Jew came from Africa with an elephant. And so Isaac appears to have been someone who was living in Charlemagne's court. He was with Charlemagne, and him being the one to escort this elephant all the way back to Europe. It took him 2 years. He had to get the elephant onto a boat. It was a long, arduous process. But he got the elephant back to Germany, and it's sort of a sign that Jews were positively treated in Charlemagne's court. Yeah, so think about getting the elephant all the way over from here to here would have been a pretty big deal. But yeah, it seems like Charlemagne was pretty friendly to the Jews. Isaac is a good example of that. Despite that, Charlemagne did ban the practice of money lending. Now, this is a complicated thing that led to some horrible stereotypes, but basically, in traditional Christianity, it's not thought of this way so much anymore, but in traditional Christianity, it was believed that Christians could not lend money with interest. So Christians could not be bankers. Christians could not make their money that way, because there was a fear of people being exploited. So it was, God not wanting people to be exploited. But even just like a tiny amount of interest was not considered cool. And so that role ended up being filled a lot by Jews, especially because Jews were often banned from a lot of other occupations. So they ended up being, the bankers in the job that, they could do. Unfortunately, this led to a really negative stereotype of Jews as, greedy, as money lenders and whatnot, and is responsible to some horrible stereotypes that still exist today. But it was really just this historical tension between what Christians can do and what Jews could do. So Charlemagne banned the practice, which might have meant to a lot of Jewish people losing their jobs, but he doesn't seem to have been necessarily negative on Jews in general. He seems to have been a good leader in a variety of different ways. For one thing, he was the supporter of a lot of knowledge, just like Harun al-Rashid. Charlemagne himself seems like he could barely write. He was not very well educated in that sense. But he was more of a political, more of sort of a German king from a small sort of out-of-the-way place before his empire became so significant. But he used his connections to support knowledge and learning. There was this whole movement, in fact, during his time that's called the Carolingian Renaissance. which was basically this huge boom in monks and the church copying Latin and preserving Latin texts and making copies of Latin texts so people could continue to read them. So a lot of our knowledge of science, a lot of our plays that have been preserved from Greek and Roman times, a lot of the theology that is still very influential today, a lot of this comes from the time of Charlemagne. So his Renaissance, which just means a rebirth. So it was kind of a rebirth of scholarship at that time. His sort of mini Renaissance before the famous Renaissance was a pretty big deal. Another thing that also happened during this time is there was a new Latin writing style, which involved the first lowercase letters that we see in history. And on the one hand, I'm happy for them. You know, this is a big deal. They can write text more cleanly and more precisely. I find it impossible to read myself because the letters are so close together and so tight looking. You really have to be trained in reading that kind of writing. But it was a lot easier for people at the time, apparently. And in general, it just seems to have been a good time of trade and connections. So even though he wasn't really the Roman emperor, he had his own empire, which was doing pretty well. Built a lot of cathedrals and schools, too. And just like Harun al-Rashid, after Charlemagne died, he split his empire up among his 3 sons. That was the tradition at that time. And the empire splintered. But the dream of this Holy Roman Empire concept, that would stick around. People would keep that in their minds, as we've seen. But yeah, the empire crumbled and split into these 3 different parts here. So he ultimately didn't last, but he did have a pretty significant role in history. I think in large part we should kind of think of him as the guy who put Europe, and I guess by that we mean northwestern Europe here, the part of Europe that most of us probably think of as Europe. He put that part of the world on the map, and that's going to be a pretty significant move. He also really continued to increase the power of the church, the Roman Catholic Church, and played a big role in that as well, ensuring that Germans would be Roman Catholic Christians, at least for a while, as well as the French and the Spanish. Once the Catholics take over Spain and chase out the Muslims and Jews. So yeah, that's basically Charlemagne. That's basically what he achieved. And I think that's all we've got for this time. Don't forget about the paper that is coming up at the end of class. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the discussion question where we talk about all these medieval guys, and then we'll do more medieval stuff next time.